For the first time, we're going to have a 3-person team. Everybody felt like it was a lot to take on just one person. So Greg Bartow, John Karachewski, and Paul Henshaw will carry that together. So I think that'll be very good. And people have different backgrounds, so it should give us, I think, a variety. Tom Barry will continue as membership chair, Mark Sorensen as newsletter editor, and Andrew Alden as website and social media manager. Our committee chairs, Phil Garbutt will continue to chair the scholarship committee. And then we have openings for both the K through 12 program teacher of the year position, which Paul Henshaw used to carry. So if somebody's interested in that, let us know. And the outreach position also remains open. So please contact me or Jim O'Brien if you have any interest in serving in any of these roles, either future officer or committee roles. All of these officers can always use extra help, and this is a good way to learn the ropes. I would also like to acknowledge Chris McGuffin, who continues to help us with the audiovisual setups for our meetings. Thank you very much. And then tonight, so just to conclude here for the slate of officers, there'll be an email going out with the same information, and in June is when we meet to vote on the slate of officers. So we have a dual special occasion tonight. We have 2 honorary memberships that are going to be awarded tonight. And I'll leave you in suspense for a minute. Tom, you want to come up and say a few words?
My wife told me to just tuck in my shirt. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to present these awards. These are, we don't give many of these out. They're special awards. And we're lucky to have the 3 members of our society that have been awarded this award here today: Ray Sullivan, Dora Sloan, and John Karachewski. And I know our last one, John, I was involved in giving that award. I think it took us a year and a half to actually give it. We wanted to do it in person, and COVID screwed it up. So anyway, I'm really happy that we can do this tonight. I would like to present this. I'm going to present the first award, and Noel is going to present the second one. And the award winner today is Don Lewis. And I know everybody will support him. He's worked for the society for 27 years. And at that time, he was a president and program chair just once. And then he was counselor for 27 years. But actually, he served longer than that in many respects, because a lot of you probably don't know, he was chief geologist at Chevron. And at that time, he had responsibility for probably 1,000+ geologists scattered all over the world. And his responsibility was to follow their careers, help them out, and also make sure they were up to date on the science. So in San Ramon, they had quite a number of geologists there, and he strongly supported the NCGS during his tenure there as chief geologist. And at that time, we had dozens and dozens of geologists attending our meetings in the late 80s and in the 80s and 90s. The duties of counselor, you might say there are no official duties of counselor. So that in itself, since he actually was counselor for 25 years and president and program chair for 1, doesn't really quite qualify Don. I mean, there's no duties, but so why was he chosen? And the reason being that Don is sort of like, he's at every board meeting, he's there. He's always working, it seems, almost behind the scenes. He's a man behind the scenes. He always has encourages people, he recruits people. He just seems to be, in my opinion, and I'm sure a lot of other people, the a real asset to our community of geologists. And in particular, I just every once in a while, not every once in a while, frequently, Don sort of steps in, and when we get out of line, he keeps us in line because he has excellent judgment. And Don, if you'd step up here, I'd like to give you your award. And I'd say we actually have a little trophy thing like we did in the others, but it took too long to make. So the Northern California Geologic Society hereby awards honorary membership to Don Lewis for 27 years of distinguished service. Yeah. You can stay if you want to. You don't have to stay.
That tells you how long I've been retired, because I didn't have time to do more with NCGS than just go to all the luncheon meetings, which used to be in the city, downtown, you know. And but when I retired, which was, I guess, 27 years ago, something like that, I started in with NCGS. And Tom, it's really nice. Thank you. Some of the things that Tom said about me apply to him too. He's been stalwart of the society for a long time. And he and I have lunch together sometimes. And Tom, I'll buy you the next lunch.
All right. Thank you.
So Don, at the last board meeting, objected that we were awarding 2 honorary memberships. And he said, we don't normally do that. I don't think we should do 2. And we said, well, we think we should. And, you know, we didn't want to spill the beans. But to us, it was important to award both these honorary memberships at the same time. So the other honorary membership we're awarding is to Phil Reed. Yeah. So I prepared a few notes because I'm notoriously bad public speaker. And if it's not written down, I might not say it. So let me just read this. I know it's less entertaining than if I speak from the cuff, but I might actually get it right that way. It's my great honor, with unanimous approval of the NCGS board, to award Phil Reed with a permanent honorary membership to acknowledge the many years of service he has devoted to this organization. As an aside, I should mention that Phil was my boss at Chevron for several years in the late 1980s, right after the Chevron Gulf merger. He had a well-deserved reputation for being tough, but fair. And he was always very thorough and dependable and true to his word. Those character traits have followed him to NCGS, where he has tirelessly volunteered his time and skills to nearly every activity and event that we have undertaken. His dedication, along with that of other active volunteers, is what provides the lifeblood of this organization. Phil served 8 terms as counselor to the NCGS board, first for 3 terms in 1998 to 2001, then again from 2015 to 2020. He served as treasurer of NCGS for a record 13 consecutive terms, from 2001 to 2016. So needless to say, in the board meetings, which Phil always attends, he always has a question for the treasurer. He also served as president-elect for 2 years in 2011, 2013, while Tom Barry was president, and then succeeded Tom for 1 term as president in 2013. I also should acknowledge that Phil has agreed to fill in as president-elect for the upcoming term, seconding Jim O'Brien, who will be our next president. So thank you, Phil, for stepping up once again. And congratulations, Phil, for a very well-deserved honorary membership. So please come up here, and if you have a few words you want to add. So for now, it's just a piece of paper, but the plaque will follow.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you. Well, this is a big surprise. I'm pleased to see Don Lewis, elected honorary member before me. It's Don has done a marvelous job, including rewriting the bylaws that stated all the stuff that Noel just reiterated earlier. What to say? Nothing. Thank you, Noel. Thank you, everybody. And I look forward to continuing in the NCGS. Thank you all.
So I think that's the business part of our meeting for tonight. So Jeff, would you like to come and introduce our speaker for this evening? This is Jeff Gilman.
Thanks, Noel, and congrats to the honorary members. I'm Jeff Gilman. I'm a relatively new member of NCGS. Only retired for 5 years, so I hope I can live another 22. Is that right? And tonight I'm acting as program director. Jim O'Brien had asked me to help identify tonight's speaker. And Jim luckily is off celebrating his 50th college reunion. So I'm sure he's having a great time. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Gailey, or Rob, as he's better known. Rob leads a private consulting practice, RM Gailey Consulting Hydrogeologist, and he's been practicing since 1985. He's contributed to environmental projects such as contaminated site evaluation and remediation, as well as water supply projects. And the breadth of Rob's work has included field investigations, quantitative analysis, regulatory negotiations, and expert witness engagements. And these are Rob's words. He particularly enjoys envisioning and scoping new projects. Briefly about his credentials, he's a licensed professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist in California. And he received a Bachelor of Science in Geology from Brown University, a Master of Science in Hydrogeology from Stanford, a doctorate in Civil and Environmental Engineering from UC Davis, and to spread the wealth around, an MBA from UC Berkeley. And tonight, Rob will draw on his broad background and extensive experience and talk about groundwater management in California. And he welcomes spirited discussion and questions about the material he presents. So please don't be shy. And with that, Rob, thank you.
Thanks. Chris, how's my hair? Is it okay? Okay. So how are we going to do this hybrid? Hello, everybody, in here in the Masonic auditorium, as well as at home on Zoom and the Zoom viewership. I guess so. We're just going to have this. Everyone can see this now on Zoom and here. And the click. Okay, and the clicker works. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about groundwater management in California. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. It's very multidisciplinary, and I'm going to try to cover a lot of material here to try to give you an accurate sense of what's going on in the state right now. So, ready to? Can the Zoom people see the screen? Okay, good. Yeah? Okay, and let's see. That's not working. So let me try this way. No? Move the mic a little bit closer. I'll move the mic. I'll move closer to the mic, but in terms of changing the slides, doesn't seem to be working there. I can just say next slide. No, it's fine. How's it working? The down one? You had to get it going. Okay. So the goals of the presentation tonight, I'm going to try to describe California's groundwater management challenges to you. In particular, I would like to highlight some of the physical and economic processes that are involved, summarize some of our progress towards regulated management in the state, and show it at least one example of combined hydrogeologic and economic thinking that helps address the challenges. There are many examples, but we're a little bit time constrained tonight. I've got some slides in reserve. If you ask the right questions, more slides will pop up. So there's a lot of information here. Don't worry about all the details. We'll discuss it after the presentation. I'm going to give my email address. If you want to confer afterwards, that's great as well. So here's our outline. We're going to talk about California groundwater a little bit. Then I'm going to summarize some of the economic concepts that are important to understand in order to think about managing the resource, talk about the recent regulations, and then I'll give you this example. We'll talk about managed aquifer recharge, which is very important for doing groundwater management, and then we'll have discussion. So California groundwater, we're going to break this into pieces. We're going to talk about California, then we're going to talk about groundwater, then we're going to talk about the two of them together. So as most people in this room, or probably everyone knows, California is a very large state. When I was a field geologist, I was taught to always put something in the picture for scale. If it were a small feature I was taking a picture of, I'd use a lens cap. If it were large, I'd use a human being. Well, you know that I graduated from Brown, and several years ago, I gave this talk back in Rhode Island, and I chose to use the state of Rhode Island as my measure of scale. So California is about 135 times the size of the state of Rhode Island. California spans a latitude of about 9.5 degrees. And last time I checked, it was the 5th largest economy in the world. This latitude is, to get a sense of what this means. If you drive in March from Sacramento, now I can use the pointer here, but they won't see it at home. Pointer's the bottom one, right? So if we drive from Sacramento down to Bakersfield in March during the almond bloom season, when the trees are blooming, in Sacramento, you won't see any blooms yet. Maybe the buds are just about to pop. As you progress south, you'll see lots of blooms. And by the time you get to Bakersfield, the petals are already on the ground. So the season moves from south to north, and the state is so large that they don't all bloom at once. I advanced it. Yeah, that's fine. I think that's perfectly fine. So it's a land of contrasts. Looking at the Central Valley as sort of our anchor geologic feature, it's ringed with mountains that are created. I'm not going to belabor the point or go into the details in this crowd, but they're all created in different ways and have different features associated with them. We're very wet in the north. We have deserts in the south. Different economic drivers from in the past, maybe lumber and mining, and now maybe vacation tourism in some of those areas. Lots of agriculture in parts of the state and urban activities in other parts of the state. The one thing that's the same across the state of California is a singular need for reliable water supplies. So if we take a look at this figure from PPIC, I can't remember, PPIC. It summarizes water use and the variations in the amount and the application of that water use in California. Blue being environmental flows, so that flow in rivers and the such. Green being agricultural, red being urban. You can see that there's lots of environmental flows up in the north. The Central Valley has quite a bit of agricultural development. On the coast, both north and south, you see a lot of urban demands. But there's quite a bit of a swing from a wet year to a dry year. If you look at in the middle there, you'll see it's about a 40% difference in the millions of acre feet of water supply at an average wet year versus maybe an average dry year. But if you take the percentages for urban and agricultural use in those years and do the math, you'll realize that the use of water and the supply for agriculture and the supply for urban use are fairly constant. The difference between a dry year and a wet year is maybe 10%, whereas the difference for the environmental is maybe 70%. And the reason for this is groundwater. Groundwater plays a role. It buffers the shortfalls in surface water supply in order to have a reliable water supply. And there are implications for this, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we talked about California. Now let's talk about groundwater. What is it? Well, it's water that fills the pore spaces between sediment grains, or in a hard rock environment, it's water that fills the joints and the fractures in the rocks. Now, for years, I've given a class to my kids' school when they were in preschool, and then when they were in grade school, I would fill up a glass right to the brim with sand, and I'd have another glass full of water. And I'd ask the kids, what's going to happen if I pour this water on top of this sand? And some of them guessed right away that it was going to go into the pore spaces between the sand, and others realized this as we did the experiment. So let's think about a groundwater system now. This is a cross section, and we have our vertical in the dimension, and we have our horizontal dimensions here. We have land surface is this black line from uplands to lowlands, and then in the subsurface we have some strata, fine grained materials, clays and silts are in gray, and the coarser grained materials, the sands and the gravels, are in white. And then we have a water surface, a groundwater surface, this blue dashed line. We have a surface water feature as well. So there are lots of inputs and outputs in these systems, and many of them occur at the same time, and some of them occur to greater extents than others, depending upon the situation, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we know that we can have recharge from rainfall percolating into the subsurface. We can have, if irrigation is applied greater than the amount that needs to be transpired by plants and is evaporated as a result of heating of the soil surface, some of that water passes the root zone and ends up as recharge. We can also have water seep into the groundwater system from surface water bodies if the pressure in the groundwater system is less than the pressure at the bottom of the surface water body. Then there are the outputs. I've mentioned evapotranspiration already. Then there can be a mechanical removal of water as a result of pumping. And there can also be outflow to surface water bodies as a result of if the pressures in the groundwater system are higher than the pressures in the surface water system. And in fact, these flows to surface water systems are what keep our rivers and creeks flowing during the dry season. If there's no more water running down from the highlands because all the snow has melted and the rain has stopped and the snow has melted and the river continues to flow, it's because the groundwater system is supporting that surface water body. Right, so then let's take a look at what a system might look like if it's not perturbed by humans, if there's no pumping involved. This is sort of a pre-development kind of a picture. Well, you may have recharge in the highlands where you have some coarse deposits at the foot of mountains, and the water will then flow down through the system, these black arrows, and then it will discharge into, at a low point in the system, into a surface water body. And we can write an equation that's very similar to the way you balance your checkbook when we think about the groundwater budget, which we're balancing the ins and the outs and how much remains in the resource stock. So if our input is recharge, that equals what comes out, the input equals what is taken out plus the change in what is left in the system. So if 100 units go in and 90 units go out, well, then we know that the stock has increased, the storage has increased by 10 units. This can change seasonally. In the wet season, you can have a lot of recharge occurring, and then the recharge stops. And as while the recharge is occurring, you'll have increases in the storage, and then the recharge stops, but the outflow continues, and then the storage will drop as the water continues to flow out to the surface water body. You think about a development situation where you add a pump, and now you'll either reduce the amount of water that's flowing to that surface water body, or maybe even reverse the flow, and there are modifications to the water budget equation as appropriate. Okay, so now let's talk about California groundwater. We're going to focus on the Central Valley, and it's indicated here. We know that it's aerially extensive. It's about, at its greatest dimensions, it's maybe 300 miles long, 60 miles wide. It's full of sediments that are thousands of feet thick. The shallowest 1 to 2 to 3,000 feet, depending upon where you are in the valley, is where the fresh water resides. But that's a large volume of groundwater, and it's been historically vital to agricultural production, and as it increases the reliability of the water supply. So let's think a little bit about some of the things that will change sort of the groundwater as in the water supply. One of them is rainfall. So if we look at the amount of rain that falls from January through December, we see that we have an annual drought. We have wet season and we have a dry season. That's essentially an annual drought. And during this dry season, the way that we continue to have flows in our streams is often because the Sierra snowpack, which is our largest stored volume of water, melts out. And there's a geographic trend here. The northern Central Valley has much more rainfall than does the southern Central Valley. Digging into that a little bit deeper, we can look at the precipitation, average annual precipitation in California, blue being the highest, red being the lowest. And we see that there's quite a difference from north to south. There's also a difference from the coast inland, but in general, about roughly 2/3 of the precipitation falls in the northern half of the state. We could then take a look at where that water might be used, especially in the Central Valley. Now, what I'm showing here, the blue lines are the hydrologic regions, the watersheds. And we have 3 of them for the Central Valley. There's the Sacramento Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, and the Tulare Lake Basin. And then I'm also showing on this figure all of the groundwater basins in California. These are the sedimentary groundwater basins in California, the ones that DWR has mapped as groundwater basins. Many of them, especially the ones in the Central Valley, contain a lot of land for agriculture, lots of agricultural development. In 2014, the agricultural revenue in the state is listed here. And together, this is, I think it adds up to 89% or 88% of the total agricultural revenue for the state of California occurs in the Central Valley. So agriculture is notable. It's 80% of the world almonds demand is supplied by the Central Valley. The largest corporate grower of carrots globally resides and operates in the Central Valley. Second largest supplier of pistachios. And lots of this land is in perennials, in trees and vine crops, which will become more important in a minute. There's significant investments and expectations for financial returns from all this agricultural activity. And it's also a source of jobs and culture. To give you a sense of how large agricultural production and the operations are in California, this picture down at the bottom here is an almond processing facility. And these piles that look like piles of sand are actually piles of almond hulls. That's the part that's torn off, the hull, the fleshy part, and the nut that's taken off, or the shell that's taken off to get the nuts that actually go to retail outlets. And there are many of these processing facilities around the Central Valley. Just gives you a sense it's 2 stories high. So now let's think about the climate and the business together. There's actually a physical and economic dislocation here in terms of the geography. We know that 2/3 of the water is precipitation in the northern half of the state, and a very significant, massive amount of the agricultural production is occurring in the southern part of the state, and specifically in the southern part of the Central Valley. So that water is an input to agricultural production. So not surprisingly, surface water is exported from the north to the south. It's moved to meet agricultural demand as well as urban demand. And there are these water projects, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but essentially canals, which many of you are familiar with, that move that water. But there are limitations to how much water that can be moved. When there's a drought and there's not enough surface water, they can't move water that isn't there. When there's an environmental impact, it's going to be occur as a result of moving that water, and a lot of this water has to move through the delta. And we have some sensitive species so pumping can't occur at certain points in time. Or if there's climate change, which again changes the availability of water, we're going to have some limitations. So groundwater is also used heavily, and many of these basins are in overdraft. That is, groundwater is being mined. More water is being taken out than is being replenished. So there's a picture of one of these canals that's looking south in a big cement-lined canal. You can see the Coast Range in the distance. And we have a map of all the different projects here. I'll mention some of them in a minute. So these droughts that I mentioned that are going to limit the amount of water that we can move to the south occur pretty frequently. And the flip side of the coin is floods, right? So we have drought and flood cycles. And you can see on this map, this is a plot of departure from average precipitation over time, starting in 1950, moving up to the late 2010s. And whenever you get several of these years in a row where you have less than average precipitation, you end up with a drought. Here's a big one. We had 1987 to 1992. I moved to California right at the beginning of this drought. And then here was the drought before the one that just ended. This was the 2012 to 2016 drought. And this is what Lake Oroville looked like. The water line, when it's full, is up near the trees, and our surface water was very low, and our ability to move water to the south was not very great. Therefore, more groundwater was being used. So in that 2012 to 2016 drought, surface water supply was down 50%, and groundwater use was up 100%. So I mentioned climate change as well. So I mentioned that the Sierra Nevada are our largest source of stored water, our largest capability of storing water. Well, as the climate warms, the predictions are that less and less water is going to be stored in the Sierra Nevada. At the same time, we're seeing the water melting out sooner. So this red line, I guess I should first orient you, we go from October through September. So we're looking at the water year here on the horizontal axis, and this is the amount of runoff per month. And this red line is what was occurring during the first half of the 20th century. So the first half of the 1900s. And this blue line is roughly the second half of the 1900s. And you see that early on in the 1900s, you'd start to get peak meltout sort of in the middle of the spring, and it would persist on into the late spring, early summer. And then in the second half of the 1900s, that meltout shifted a couple of months earlier. So as a result, of climate change, we're going to have less water stored, and it's going to spill before it's needed. So this is a problem, and we're going to have to use managed aquifer recharge to get around this. We're going to have to capture that water and put it in another storage bin, which will be the groundwater system, in order to address this. So if you think about what California groundwater has happened to the California groundwater system as a result of surface water diversions and groundwater pumping, we can take a look at what the Central Valley looked like pre-development and post-development. So it's a little sort of block diagram with a cross section on the front of it. Sierra Nevada is on the right, Coast Range is on the left. And one thing to realize right away is that the water surface, the pressure in the subsurface, was above land surface. If you were to have stuck a straw or a well down into the deep strata back in the late 1800s, the well would flow without a pump even in it. It would flow at tens to hundreds of gallons a minute. But as a result of development and drawing the pressures down and the water levels down, this no longer occurs in most places. There's also quite a bit of water diversion. Surface water is captured as it comes out of the mountains and is diverted and used on crops instead of making its way down to the natural water courses. So there are some water courses that have dried up. And the best example of this I know is on Route 152 east of Los Banos. So this is the San Joaquin River, which flows to the north. And then right next to it, there's an irrigation canal, which is set up to gravity drain and flow to the south. And in early spring, during the last drought, 2015, the San Joaquin River was dry, bone dry, and this irrigation canal was full of water and flowing the opposite direction. I mentioned the drop in pressure and the drop in water levels. That also leads to land subsidence. So some of you may be familiar with this picture of Joseph Poland, a famous USGS hydrogeologist. And in the late 70s, he stood next to a post and he showed where the land surface was in the mid-1920s and where it was in the mid-1970s. It had dropped about 30 feet over that 50-year time period. And when the land surface sinks, it doesn't do it uniformly. It warps the land surface, and you'll see some of your canals buckling. This is a cement-lined canal. The land surface has differentially subsided, and this canal has buckled, so it starts to leak. In some cases, they don't gravity flow in the right direction or at the right amount and the right quantities anymore. That's a problem that you might have heard of that's been happening with the Friant-Kern Canal. You also get ruptures in the land surface. And then more recently, in the early 2010s, Michelle Sneed, another USGS hydrogeologist, did a similar picture. For about a 50-year period, she showed how much the land had subsided during that period. Let's see if I can change the picture. Okay, so the way it actually occurs, this picture addresses what happens in the sand and gravel deposits. The same thing happens, and maybe even to a greater extent, in our finer grain deposits in the subsurface. But basically, before development, there's a force balance. At some point in the subsurface, there's a certain amount of force by the weight of the overlying sediments, and that's counteracted and balanced by friction between the grains, the sediment grains, and the pore pressure, the pressure in those pores. Well, if you reduce the pressure in the pores, you've changed the force balance. And then the overburden overcomes the grain friction, the grains rearrange and the land compacts, the sediments compact, and the land surface sinks. And we have a map here of what some of the extent of some of these subsidence areas look like. And if you look in the southern Central Valley, this is ground zero for industrial agriculture. There is a very large subsidence area. And let's see if I can change there we go. And it's the result of overdraft. That is more groundwater being taken out than is being put in. So mining to the tune of 2 million acre feet a year. Now, an acre foot is about 1/3 of a million gallons. So this is 2/3 of a trillion gallons of water a year being mined from the subsurface in this area. And as a result, there's this land subsidence. And remember the scale. There's Rhode Island again. This is like 4 Rhode Islands. Right? Or another way to think about it is to look at San Jose. There's San Francisco. Santa Rosa's up here somewhere. It's about, I don't know, 2.5, 3 times the distance from San Jose to Santa Rosa to drive from the southern end to the northern end of this subsided area. So this is a huge feature that's being created by just massive amounts of water that are being mined. Tulare Lake is down in that area. I've got some slides in the question and answer session for that. So let's talk a little bit now about economic concepts. How do we get here? Why are people doing this? Why is it just sort of happening naturally? Like in terms of the way people interact, not naturally in terms of the way the hydrology would be without us. In brief, it has to do with consumer demand for agricultural products. Consumer demand drives agricultural output. There are national and global markets for these products. The high product demand increases the use of groundwater because water is an input to agricultural production, and groundwater is used to shore up the reliability of that water supply. Right? And the market dynamics involved here don't compensate for the follow-on effects for this overdraft, the land subsidence and some of the other things that I'll talk about in a minute. So now let's dig it a little bit deeper. I'm going to name these processes here, and then I'm going to show a slide for each one afterwards. So groundwater is something that we call a common pool resource. And there's a tendency towards overusing that resource. And as a result, there are these negative economic externalities that occur. And when you wrap that whole ball of wax together, you end up having the potential for something called tragedy of the commons. And in order to manage this problem, you're going to have to change the status quo. And there are going to be trade-offs between different stakeholder interests, and there's going to be some friction there. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So common pool resource, sort of the definition in resource economics, it's the size of the characteristics of the resource is such that it's difficult for you to exclude users. Anybody that wants to use it can get at it. And it's subject to overuse. Applied to groundwater, we know that groundwater is distributed throughout a basin. It can be extracted from different locations. And just because you extract it here doesn't mean all the effects are going to stay here. Because of flow, those effects are going to spread on out. And the effects of each user are additive. They all add together and you can deplete the resource. Whoop, wrong way. So here's one of my poor cartoons. There's the land surface and the groundwater underneath. And it's an open access resource. Everyone can put their wells in. And each person makes an independent decision about their use. And here I've depicted some cones of depression. This is what happens. When you pump a well, the water levels are drawn down most near the well, and then they extend out away from the well. And these drawdowns will actually propagate out into the system over time. And somebody else can do the same thing. And then the results add together to give you a total drawdown in the system, decrease in the pressure, or decrease in the water level. So now let's think about this tendency towards overuse. You have to look at this plot a little bit upside down. If we think about, whoops, where did I go? There we are. If you have a total supply that you need to irrigate a crop, and you have a certain amount of surface water available, and this is time on the horizontal axis. So here's a year where we have a lot of surface water, year 2, and then in year 4, there's much less surface water available. Well, in order to keep a constant supply, you need to vary the amount of groundwater you use. So in a year when you have a surface water drought, you're going to use more groundwater in order to keep that supply constant. Right, and there are a lot of benefits to having a constant supply. You avoid the high costs of purchasing water on the spot market during a drought when the costs are going to be high. That you get favorable financial underwriting and interest rate setting for loans when you have a reliable source of water, so that the bank knows that you're going to be able to bring your crop to harvest and sell it and be able to make good on the loan. It increases property values and business valuations, and it increases the viability of long-term investments. So as a result, we have what's called demand hardening, and that's when people have a reduced ability or willingness to forego a shortage in supply during a dry year. So as a result, again, there's heavy reliance on groundwater. So this is a cash flow plot. I want to sort of talk about what happens with these perennial crops, these trees and these vines. So the way a cash flow plot works is we have time on the horizontal axis, cash flows on the vertical axis, downward bars are outflows of cash, upward bars are inflows of cash. And if you think about a tree crop, what happens is a lot of money is spent up front to plant the crop and to install the irrigation system. And then it takes several years before that crop is ready to actually produce. So you need to spend more money, labor and materials, tending that orchard to maturity. And at some point, it begins to produce. And then you have, whoops, I did it again. Then at some point, you have positive flows. And at some point, then they're going to drop off over time. And you might have a more productive crop, tree orchard versus a less productive orchard. So I have 2 different levels of green bar here. But basically, when you wrap this thing all up and you discount it to present value, which is something we do in finance and business, you can figure out what the return is. So you could have a high return, maybe 30%, or maybe a lower return for less productive land of 5%, but it works out. And then at the end of the 25 years, you tear out the trees and you start again. So what happens if we have a drought in year 11 and we have a limited surface water supply? If we just stop irrigating, we foreclose on that revenue stream and we change the returns significantly. They all go down. They might even go negative. So there's a financial impact. So as a result, groundwater use, which gives you that reliable supply of water, preserves the asset. So people are going to use groundwater. So they all put in their wells and they drop the water levels. As a result, you have these negative impacts, and we'll talk about some of them: domestic wells going dry, land subsidence. You can have changes in water quality, degradation of surface water rights, things like that. They're all negative economic externalities. And here's the definition. So it's a cost borne by a party that isn't participating or benefiting from the cost generating action. And they don't have any recourse. They don't get compensated. And a textbook example is this, situation where you have a power plant and it has smoke emissions and they impact a laundry operation, say. It's sort of a simple little example, but if a power plant, revenue goes in, there are some costs, power comes out, profit is generated, but there's also smoke, which creates other costs. The laundry next door is drying its laundry and now they have to wash it again, right? So that's sort of a indication of an economic externality. In groundwater, one agent's pumping decisions impact others' uses of the common pool resource. So an example would be if you pump a well and it's near a stream and it intercepts water that would otherwise end up in that stream and support the flow of that stream, and there's a surface water rights, somebody with surface water rights, a user downstream that now doesn't get their full allotment. So they've experienced a negative externality as a result of the groundwater pumping. The fiction is that all the drawdowns stay on the property where the well is, right? Another example would be domestic wells that go dry. If an agricultural well has a deeper well and pumps the water levels down, this domestic well can experience water quality problems, decreases in the amount of water that it can produce. It can even go dry so that it can't produce water. And that happened quite a bit during the last two droughts, that is the 2012 to 2016 drought, and the one that we just ended as well. And I did quite a bit of work on this down in the Tulare County. And when somebody's water supply well stops working and they have to go to town to get water, and they have to bring jugs to town on a daily basis or on a frequent basis, that really impacts life. In fact, if you look at underdeveloped countries, this is one of the reasons why girls drop out of school in middle school. They have to walk back and forth to a water supply multiple times a day to move enough jugs of water for the family to have water for the day. Okay, so then we end up with this tragedy of the commons when you wrap it all up into a ball of wax. So the idea here is that an individual agent, a single pumper, will say, well, you know, I'm going to draw the water levels down a little bit and I'll have a little bit of extra lift cost, but that's not so bad because I'm going to be able to sell more of my product. So I'm going to benefit more than I lose. The problem is when everybody does the same thing, then all those impacts aggregate and everyone loses. Everyone has a problem, right? So the best example to really grok this that I have come up with is baggage pickup at the airport, right? So if you're on that flight from New York or Chicago, a lot of people show up at the carousel all at once. At first, they're all sort of standing back because the carousel isn't moving. There's no luggage coming out. And Sarah, my wife, knows this well because I start to grumble as the luggage starts to come out. A couple of people move forward, and then a couple of more people move forward. And then everyone else says, well, if they're moving forward, I might as well move forward. And then everyone is shins up against the stainless steel, right? And no one can get their luggage. So that's tragedy of the commons in a nutshell. But, you know, again, back to my simple picture, well, I'm going to get a little bit of money if I draw the water down a little bit. I'm going to get some more money if I draw the water down a little bit. So I'll do it. And then your friend does it, and their cousin does it, and then their friend does it, and the neighbor does it. And then you have all these groundwater impacts, surface water depletion, land subsidence, water quality degradation, and some others. Final slide on economics. So in order to manage a groundwater system like this, you're going to have to change the status quo. And as a result, some stakeholders may lose and some stakeholders may gain. And there are going to be points of friction. No one likes to lose, and everyone has a different way that they think it should be allocated. And there are many, you know, so here I'm looking at back up again. So here's an unmanaged situation. Here's the total supply, this green bar, and it's more than the limit. You say, okay, so we got a couple of different ways we can get the total use down to the limit, but they all change the amount of water that each of these parties gets. You can do it pro rata, you can do it per capita, you can do it based upon rights seniority, you can do it based upon some human right to water and equity. They're all different. So this is the challenge that we have in regulating groundwater, which leads us to the recent regulations. Okay, so just a little bit of background. We have these surface water import projects that began. The federal project began in the late 30s. The California State Water Project began in 1960. And for a while, this worked great. Groundwater levels actually started to come back up, but demand continued to increase and groundwater impacts started to mount again in the 80s. And there were some early attempts at groundwater regulation in the 90s and the 2000s, but they weren't very effective. They weren't stringent enough. So we had more groundwater impacts. At the same time, there were some developments in water law. It was established in the 80s. The state holds surface water in public trust, and that water use should keep pace with the economic needs and public values. And a little bit later, some of these arguments started to be applied to groundwater as well. At the same time, we had some prominent groundwater quality issues. We had ongoing nitrate and emerging arsenic contamination problems. In 2011, the United Nations went through the Central Valley and looked at the water quality problems for drinking water for disadvantaged communities, primarily Hispanic disadvantaged communities, farm workers, and they likened the conditions or compared the conditions to those in the developing world. At the same time, there was legislative advocacy and press coverage. And then we got this set of legislators and regulators with some resolve to start creating some initial legislation that was pointing towards managing groundwater. There were little pieces of legislation at first, but then we had this drought. Towards the end of that period, we had this big drought right about the time that I came to California in 1987. We had a 5-year drought, and it was we had this drought in 2012, and it was the first big one since the 5-year drought when I had come to California. In those 20 years, since 1992 to 2012, the population had grown significantly, and the effects of this drought were more publicly visible. There was more press coverage, but this was also the first big drought when we had the internet to really disseminate the information. So as a result, of all of what I've said on this page, the legislative action, and I think the visibility of this drought, we ended up with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014, which we refer to as SGMA, and it requires heightened management in many of the subbasins, these red and orangish subbasins. There are 2 groups of basins, and the red ones had to prepare groundwater sustainability plans and send them to the Department of Water Resources by January of 2020. And the goldish ones had to do it by January of 2022. And the idea was, and the charge was, to avoid significant and unreasonable groundwater impacts. And the types of impacts there were 6 of them that they had to consider: lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of storage, inducing seawater intrusion, degrading water quality in other ways, land subsidence, and surface water depletion. So central to the SGMA approach is local control of the management. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the conditions vary so much around this state that the holders of the best technical knowledge are thought to be the local people. And there's also a sort of an interest alignment. The locals should want their groundwater to be managed sustainably. But the regulations recognize that there are some impediments to good decision-making, and a lot of that comes from outside influences. There are corporations that own land in the Central Valley that aren't located there. It's just a base of operations for making money. Some of the companies are publicly traded. There are loans and the like and such. So there are other influences. So there's this backstop, this review process that's both by the Department of Water Resources and public comment. And then there's the potential for enforcement, sending sending some of these basins to enforcement at the State Water Resources Control Board. So here's a hypothetical hydrograph. Water depth increases downward time as you move across. Starting in 2015, when responsibility under SGMA began, we were in a drought, so you'd expect groundwater levels to continue to drop. But at some point, as we're implementing over a 20-year time horizon and then managing sustainably over a 30-year time horizon, you'd expect these declines to be brought under control and ultimately for the water levels to be brought to manage about some sort of a target. So there's a target in SGMA, which is called a measurable objective. And then there's a recognition that there might be some hard times, there might be some droughts, and you might have to draw water levels down for a short period of time, but there's a hard stop called the minimum threshold. So this is what California looks like in the Southern Valley with irrigation and without. So if we're not going to be able to pump as much groundwater as we need to shore up the water supply, we're going to have some dry looking land. We're going to have to fallow some land. And while we recognize that the industry produces economic benefits, we also have to recognize that the use is disproportionate. Agriculture creates about 25% of the revenue and 16% of the jobs in California, but it accounts for 89% of the net water use. Okay. So as a result, there's tension and concern, and you may have seen some of these billboards as you drive up and down the state. The facetious rhetorical question, is growing food wasting water? Or some of the other ones that are here. So does this mean I lost my connection again when it makes the pong noise? The top button, then push the down button. You can just change the slide for me. Will it change? Are we stuck? Well, the next couple of slides just summarize sort of where the regulations have gotten to, maybe escape, but then go back into it again. Yeah, all right. There we go. So here's what's going on with these basins. So those red ones, the critically overdrafted basins, 6 of the basins have been approved. All the plans in the basins have been approved. 7 are under revision. They were sent back for more work. A couple are still being reviewed, and 6 were outright rejected and sent for enforcement. And the reasons include geographic coordination and dry domestic wells, which I'll mention in a minute. And the higher medium priority basins, they're just starting to approve some of them. They're just getting going there. So let's see if I can change my deal now. There we go. So this geographic coordination is interesting. Most of these basins have more than one plan. They've been divvied up into patches, and each has its own GSA, or Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And when they decide that they're going to manage to significantly different groundwater levels, we got a physical problem, because the guy that wants to have shallower levels can't do it when right across the borderline there's somebody else that's going to have significantly deeper levels. And then some of these basins, they didn't give enough consideration to how many domestic wells they were going to dry up by picking a low management target, and that's an equity issue. So that's it. And I'm just going to give you a very quick example on managed aquifer recharge. So I think I'm just going to jump to it here. So this is a site south of Sacramento, where there's a source of water, and we could put recharge on this facility, and it will help us with the groundwater budget, and maybe also support some of the flow in the Cosumnes River. So the geophysicists in the room might find this interesting. Electrical resistivity tomography results. We did some of this. And these hotter colors, the reds and the purples, we expected were likely a sand and gravel structure based upon some geophysics work and continuous coring that we did at another site very nearby. So we decided to put in an unsaturated zone well to recharge the area. Lots of sand and gravel. In fact, I knew that we were near where the California gold rush began, and I saw these little gold flecks. So I got out my best Tupperware, right? And I panned it out, and then I took a tine of a fork, and they were brittle, right? So it's pyrite, it's fool's gold. It's not malleable, it's not gold. But it was exciting. We did some hydraulic testing and looked at how many wells might be required to address the budget deficit. And, we were looking at 380 gallons a minute, 210 gallons a minute for various amounts of time. That's a pretty good flow in one of these wells. Then we got this flood that occurred at the end of December, and we had all of our instrumentation in there and the telemetry going. And it turns out that this well can take about 2,000 gallons a minute. So really fantastic deposits. If we can find a couple of instances of this in this basin, we can put in maybe 10 of these wells and be able to address the whole groundwater budget deficit. Fantastic. So these things cost a lot of money, though. So what are you going to do when you don't have enough money in a basin to do it? And here's where some of the economic thinking comes in. Why not find an investment partner and create a bank and align the interests of both groundwater management and a banking partner, say a water supplier for a municipality that doesn't want to have to buy water on the spot market and spend a lot of money during the shortage period. So this is what the banking would look like if you have again, departures from, precipitation departures from average. If you have dry years and wet years, what you could do is in the wet years, put water in, and the dry years, take the water out, and you'd have an account balance that you were tracking, and you couldn't take more water out than you had already put in. And if you look at the cash flow on it, like the cash flow diagram I showed you before, there'd be a big expense up front in order to construct the facilities, and then little bits of expense when you were putting water in the ground, operational expenses. But then in these years where you were able to take the water out, it was a dry year and you were able to take out your banked water, you would realize a benefit because it would cost you essentially nothing, a little bit of power cost to take this water out of the ground instead of paying the price for the water on the spot market. And over time, your net present value, the value of a project like this, would climb, and you'd end up with a positive net present value project, which is what someone's going to need if they're making an investment decision. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening. And there's my contact info and some of my hobby photographs. I know John is here, who's a great photographer. So.
Someone grab that light that's off in the back, please. Thank you.
So if there are any questions on Zoom as well, Chris, I don't know if you can see anything there. So question, yeah, please.
In the water. The challenge is understanding how it works is when there is no water to sell. And when there's a lot of water, then you don't have anyone to sell it to. So how does the water bank work year to year?
So when there is a significant amount of water, an oversupply of water, if you will, the water is put into the ground instead of allowing it to flow out the rivers and out to the bay and then out to the ocean, which in the past, engineers have referred to that as wasting water to the sea, which is a bit of an outdated term. But rather than letting it escape your ability to use it, you store it in the groundwater system. And then in a year when you want it, you take it back out.
And the economics of that is that, I mean, I'm happy to know there's water in the aquifer. How am I gonna pay for that? Or how am I gonna benefit from it?
So the way it's conceptualized and the way we're working towards making some of these occur is it's like a front-loaded mutual fund. Essentially, you put in 100 units of water. Say you're the banking partner, you're the municipality that would like to be able to use the water in a dry year. You put 100 units of water in, and if you were to take it out right away again, you'd only be able to take out 85 units because there's a 15% front-loading fee. That's a fee for the aquifer health. So that's what the people who are letting you use the aquifer, who live there, are letting you use it. They're getting some benefit because you're recharging their system. You're donating some of your water. The rest of the water, as long as you don't leave it there for too long and it doesn't flow away, is available for you to pump back out during a dry year. And you would have paid for the facilities to inject and remove the water. So up front, you pay for the facilities. That's that big red bar that goes downward. And then over time, when you have a need and you pull the water out, you realize the benefit because instead of spending a lot of money, like to the tune of a couple $1,000 an acre foot for the water in a dry year, when you'd have to buy it from somebody else who would be willing to forego it. And these things do happen. People will fallow their land and sell the water if it's worth more to them than their crop. You would not have to spend that money, so you would realize the value instead. Okay, we can probably talk about it more offline. So I think there's some other questions. Yeah. Yeah, you account for it. There's ways, but yeah, it's not, I mean, it's not rocket science, but it is science. So, okay, lots of other questions. So yeah, please.
It's always the question, if you're going to recharge, where you're going to put it. I've seen suggestions of trying to locate ancestral rivers and recharging into those areas. Is there anything actually being done with that, or is it kind of academic dream?
No, that's exactly what we were doing here. You're probably referring to Graham Fogsworth's work on Incised Valley Fills. And I've published with him on specifically that in this area. And what we're looking at here are some of those Incised Valley Fills. Yeah, so we're looking for old stream channels. And in this area, near the Cosumnes River, south of Sacramento, we're looking for the ancestral American River channel. It used to flow further to the south. So, yeah.
We had a talk by somebody from the Napa Sonoma Valley Water District that preceded this the groundwater plan and claimed it was a model for it. Whether that's true or not isn't my question. Their account of that success I took away was twofold. One is there were a lot of local wine grape landowners, a diffuse structure. So there was no one big interest with the power to essentially check everyone else in the elected water district. And secondly, the people who were adjacent to the north part of San Francisco Bay were terrified out of their boots of saltwater intrusion, which would ruin their irreparable ruined and irreparable. That was the account of why that had the political moxie to succeed. What is the parallel, if any, in the valley for those two interests, a few small landowners and some people who will ultimately be ruined and pretty quickly unless they get this under control?
Okay, so let me try to tease that apart a little bit. So you're asking, I'm not sure about the Napa situation, whether it was under the new regulation Sigma or not
Oh,
earlier. Yeah. So when you have a market failure, which is essentially what's going on here, when you have everyone pumping and you have these negative economic externalities, you need to have an intervention, and it's usually by government or by NGOs or by both in order to improve a situation, in order to improve equity, essentially, when you're thinking about the different parameters that we are concerned with in economics. The purpose of Sigma is to change the shape of the table, if you will. It's to put constraints on the space in which people are going to operate such that they are more likely to act together to manage the resource. So the way it works here in the Central Valley, and I guess I can talk about these couple of basins that were rejected. A lot of them were the big industrial agricultural basins, all cap letters, all big corporations, right? They didn't coordinate amongst themselves, and they didn't pay heed to the domestic well owners. Their plans got rejected. So now what happens is the State Water Resources Control Board is able to come in and by fiat, tell people how much they can pump. Thou shalt not pump more than this amount of water per acre. And if you do, we're gonna make you stop. So it's a carrot and stick kind of a situation. There's still an art to it. There are basically over 100 of these plans out there, and there are essentially 100 experiments that have begun simultaneously. The dice are being rolled, and we're going to see, or the jacks are being thrown out on the table, and we're going to see how many situations it works and why it works. And in other situations, it doesn't, and maybe there'll be lawsuits and there'll be enforcement by the agencies. And a lot of us were sitting back and saying, we don't think that the agencies actually have the capability to enforce on more than a couple of basins at once. So I personally thought it was a game theory problem. I thought that the agencies were going to come out and hit the first one really hard and really publicly, so that the fear of God was in everybody else, so that they towed the line. Well, it's coming out a little bit differently than that. 6 of them are now potentially going to be under enforcement, but there's a process there. They have ways of getting out from under the enforcement thumb relatively quickly and getting back into the sort of compliance and working towards sustainable management. And we'll just see how it plays out. So it's the best I can tell you for now.
Conservative Valley Water District, I guess having.
Can you hold one second? We're gonna have to, like, Zoom people are having trouble hearing. It's not picking up, so hold this one. This wasn't worth that.
For a conservative Republican water user like the Westland Waters District,
They can hear him. You guys just.
having a Democratic controlled state water agency set your rules is probably as bad as saltwater intrusion would have been for the Napa and Sonoma Valleys. So that might work.
And you saw the billboards, so there's a lot of tension. There's a lot going on here, and there's some other ugly stories that I could tell, but I think I should probably just get to some more questions instead. Did you have a question in the back? I thought I saw your hand up at one point. No? Anybody else have questions? Yeah.
Hold on. Next up.
What's the risk to groundwater from when you're recharging from the surface like that, of surface contaminants getting into those aquifers, like fumigants and pesticides from those orchards and and whatever else? Was there any monitoring or
I think what we'll do is I'm going to paraphrase the question so we don't have to go back and forth too much. That's a great question. So if the water, it depends upon how the water is delivered to the subsurface and how closely it's delivered to the saturated zone, right? So if we were to put a seepage pond in, a recharge pond, and the water, it's untreated surface water, it could certainly have PFAS in it, right? Fluorinated alkyl compounds, which are now being regulated in the single parts per trillion. And it may even be in rainwater, precipitation in some places. Maybe it's going to get filtered out by interaction with the soil. If you're injecting it with a water supply well that goes right down to the saturated zone, you're not going to have the chance for that attenuation. If you use a recharge well like the one I had, which still left 40 to 50 feet of unsaturated zone between the bottom of the well and the top of the water table, you may still be getting as much soil interaction as you would in many cases where you have a recharge pond and the water level is shallower. So many different cases, but in general, there is a tension between quantity and quality. Those are the two parameters we're always thinking about in water supply, quantity and quality. So if you have this potential set of sources, of possible sources of recharge water, and if you take it all, you're going to maximize the quantity recharged. If you start to set a finer and finer screen on what you're going to allow because of concerns for water quality, well, then you're safeguarding water quality, but you're beginning to short yourself on the amount of water that you can put into the subsurface. So there's a tension there. It's a trade-off curve. With respect to PFAS, the forever chemicals, the ones that are in our Glide tooth floss and in our fire retardant pajamas and everything else, there used to be at least. There's an article that came out about a year ago in Environmental Science and Technology, published by a Swedish group. And the argument goes something like this. PFAS are ubiquitous in the environment. They're in the ocean as a result of wave action. They're aerosolized. Therefore, they're in the atmosphere and they're coming down in the rainwater. The amount that's in the rainwater may actually be unhealthful. You know, the Norman Rockwell picture, the little kids with their mouths open catching raindrops, that may be unhealthful with respect to PFAS, given these extremely low parts per trillion levels that we're looking at regulating to. If that's the case, then we should take all the water, and we're just worried about PFAS, we should take all the water we can and recharge it and just do point of use treatment because it's in our systems anyways. So it's going to be very case specific, and it's really going to end up in the policy realm. It's gray. It's sort of a cloud where the actual solution is. So in the back, yeah. This is the last question. Okay. We bring up the last slides. Yeah, so I've got a couple of slides on that. I knew this question was coming. So Tulare Lake, for those of you who, let's see, just go down a couple there. Let's see, I guess I can do it. Let's see here. There we go. So the Tulare Lake Basin is this southernmost hydrologic region in the Central Valley. Whoops, we lost. Okay. You can do it, Chris. Okay, so the Tulare Lake Basin is this southern hydrologic region, this southern watershed in the Central Valley. And there are three lakes, Kaweah, Tule, and Kings, that terminate in this area. It's called the Tulare Lake Basin because it's a closed basin. The water doesn't flow anywhere. The San Joaquin Valley Basin, the water goes into the San Joaquin River and flows up and out the Delta and out the San Francisco Bay. The Sacramento Valley Basin, it all flows into the Sacramento River, into the Delta and out the Bay. But in the Tulare Lake, it's a closed basin. So there used to be this lake, but remember I said that all this water was diverted and caught and used for agricultural irrigation instead of making it into the water courses. Well, as a result of that, the lake dried up. Only a couple of times has it come back. You remember the big El Nino years in the early 80s. It came back then, came back once in the late 90s for a bit, and it's back now. Here are some pictures of it and sort of its, its historic extent. It was about 690 square miles, right? In May, it was already maybe 20% of that area, and it's going to continue to grow with snow melt. Its volume when full is about 6.5 million acre feet. And maybe in July, it'll be 1 million acre feet. When it got this full before, it took 2 years for them to pump it out and empty it. So there's a lot of water there, and people are saying, well, should we put it into the groundwater system? Well, it's not going to seep there very quickly on its own because there was a lake for hundreds of thousands of years. It's got fine grained sediments, low hydraulic conductivity, low seepage rates, right? One could drill conduits to allow the water to flow down deeper, and you might get 100 to a couple thousand gallons a minute down one of these. You'd need a ton of these wells. There's not enough drilling labor to drill them all, and you'd be allowing contamination to go straight down into your groundwater system. So I think the best approach here is probably to pump this water out into the river courses, move it on north, and then when there are places where people can take it out and put it on land into ponds, to do some recharge, that's probably the best thing to do with it. Does that get at your question? Okay. Well, thanks. There's one question online. Did they drop off?
Do you want me to ask a question?
Please save me. Oh, God, yes. Yes, please.
Yeah, please ask your question.
Okay, so fishermen are regulated so they don't overfish. Anybody that's been in the oil and gas industry understands regulatory agencies. Managing groundwater is the same as managing oil production, which is why we have oil and gas commissions. Storing groundwater is a lot like storing natural gas in salt caverns. So it makes so much sense. Why aren't we doing this at scale, or are we?
This being what? Managing groundwater or recharging groundwater?
Managing and recharging.
So we're beginning to manage groundwater. So there's a tortured groundwater law history or water law history in California where groundwater was treated differently than surface water, not because of the physics, but because of what we'll call it voodoo. So there were some mistakes made early on, and as a result, it's taken a long time to sort of get a foothold to begin to do the groundwater management that we need to do. And we're now trying to do it en masse, lots of places all at once. So it's going to take a little bit of time to get there. It's a 20-year implementation period to get to management, and a lot of people have cried that that's way too long. But when you think about how long it takes to get organized, get the funding, do the plans, get the permits, do the construction, begin to do the operations, if they're recharge operations, and then allow some time for the groundwater system to actually respond to the measures that you're taking, 20 years is probably about the right amount of time. So it's going to take some time to do it. With respect to doing recharge en masse, again, there are lots of pieces to the puzzle. You need to have a water source. You need to convey it to land where there's a willing landowner that happens to have decent geology, conducive to doing the recharge. And during the rains this year, I was getting lots of calls from the New York Times and other places asking me, so many trillions of gallons of water are falling on the ground this rainy season. How much of it is going in the groundwater versus what would have happened otherwise? How much more is going in the ground as a result of managed aquifer recharge efforts? And the answer is not much yet. There's just a lot of pieces to put in place. And I actually gave a talk at a different forum a while ago where I made a case for just getting on with it. There are ways to avoid doing science on every project and moving forward with the important work of doing recharge based upon what we can learn fairly quickly and what we can learn along the way as we're moving to scale in a specific basin. So it's probably a topic for another time, but thanks for the question.
How is any of this going to be affected by the recent Supreme Court decision cutting back the EPA's ability to manage water?
That has to do with wetlands, and I haven't read the decision.
Rob, stay up here for a moment. Yeah. You read my mind. Let's all thank Rob greatly for excellent presentation of a really complicated subject. And I think Nicole would like to say a few words as well. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of NCGS, I wanted to thank you for an excellent talk. And this is our most recent publication, and the editors for this publication are sitting right here. So if you'd like them to autograph, but anyway, this is for you.
Well, thank you so much.
And encourage you to come on some of our field trips, maybe to Mount Diablo even.
I'm one of your newest members. I signed up.
Very good. Excellent. Welcome. Thank you very much. So that concludes our meeting. If you would put your non-glass recyclables